Lloyd, when you presented the upcoming PCST conference, which is taking place in New Zealand in 2018, the theme of the conference, Stories, the Soul of Science Communication, had everybody talking. Tell us a little bit about why you chose that theme and how you relate storytelling to science communication.
Thank you, Marina. That's a great question. Storytelling is really key as far as I'm concerned to science communication. And in essence, it almost characterizes what we do at the Centre for Science Communication in Otago. And it aligns with my beliefs that when you come to communicate science, you have to put it in a format that people really, really understand and also are engaged by. And storytelling has that double benefit. It's sort of like a double whammy. You benefit from people being engaged by story because we're naturally storytellers. Since time began, we've been telling each other stories. That's how we communicate with ourselves. And so if you can put something in the form of a story, you've immediately got people's attention. And then the other thing that's been useful is that research has shown that when you put things in a story, rather than watering it down or disguising the message, people actually recall the facts more or more easily if it's in a story. So I think story is important for two reasons. It engages, but it's also a really good vehicle for providing science to people.
Just maybe to add on to that a little bit, even though you say it's a natural form of communication that we've been doing for centuries, do you think it is particularly hard for scientists, maybe because of the way they are trained and the way they are used to write and used to speaking, which is maybe not in a story format?
Oh, absolutely. We spend all our training at university as scientists having any form of creative storytelling, beaten out of us because there's a formula, and it's a reasonable thing to have for scientists to communicate with each other. They use the scientific formulae that they have been using for publishing because things need to be concise, they need to be repeatable, and people need to understand things, and they have a very limited space in which to communicate to each other. The pressure on publications is very tight, as you know. And that's fine for communicating amongst scientists, but it's a bloody lousy way of communicating with each other because it's so boring, it's so full of jargon, and the one thing that will turn people off is if it's something that's just factual and full of jargon. And by putting things into a story, you make things much more entertaining and engaging. And that's the thing, that scientists are not trained to do that. And if you give them the freedom to do that, you find that many of them really enjoy it and can do that. They can express their science in a way that works for scientists, but they can also do it in a way that works for the average person on the street. The very first thing you need to do is decide what's the key bit of information that you want to get across. One thing as a scientist, and I'm a scientist by background, is that we're constantly worried about being all-inclusive and making sure we include everything there. And also, we qualify ourselves all the time. And there's nothing turns off the public more than if you say, well, it's probably this or maybe that, or, So first of all, you need to decide what's the key bit of information. And then you need to frame it in a way that makes it an interesting story. And stories really have very simple structure to them. Most of them have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you set it up by saying, why is this interesting? What's the issue here? In the middle is where you develop some sort of jeopardy, something's at stake. Because that's the thing, that's why people love stories and why they care about science, if you put it in a story, is that you have something at stake. And if people can relate to something being at stake, then they want to know the outcome. They buy into the outcome. And that's really the end. So the beginning, middle, and end. And so you resolve the story that way. And so it's honestly a really simple thing to do. And it's just that we do that naturally. When we talk to each other about what we did at the pub last week or, a holiday we took, we often format it in that very same story structure. we're also used to story structures in the books and magazine articles we read, but just the television and the films we watch. And so even though we've never been to a university or a school that's taught us what a story structure is, we have it in our heads because it's in our daily lives. And it's really letting scientists or people who are acting as the vehicles for communicating the science take it and put it back into that story format that we so love and we've been using for generations and generations.
I think that that's not a question, but anyway, that's the link with Africa. I think it's an interesting link, with culture. So say storytelling in Africa, storytelling in indigenous cultures, maybe in New Zealand. It would be interesting to explore some of those links. But sorry, that's not really a question. So
no, I think that is a really good question about if you look at the cultural aspects of storytelling and indigenous people in places like Africa or New Zealand. What you find is that the natural structure of stories is there and present in their everyday stories they tell each other. And I think, in a sense, science communicators could learn something by analysing or just observing the ways in which traditional peoples tell their stories, because they do what works. If it didn't work, they wouldn't do it. And that's what we've got to do.
Now, moving on from stories, there's going a step further, and that's putting a story into a mini film or a video. And I know that's something that you focus on also in your academic department. And you sometimes hear, video has become sort of the lifeblood of social media. It drives shares and likes and so on different platforms. Sorry. Why is video so important? Why are people so captivated by moving images?
Moving images, why do they captivate us? So I think it's because they capture real life. Like a photograph is fantastic. It captures a moment. Hearing people's words or reading them, we can visualize and imagine things. But video actually captures the world around us. So the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, a moving group of pictures is worth even more if it's the right group of moving images. And I don't know that I should be so derogatory as to say we're becoming lazy, but we're certainly changing our habits. We don't read as much as we used to. We don't listen, in an oral sense to the ways that we used to communicate. So a lot of us are getting most of our entertainment, but also our information through moving pictures. You've only got to look at something like YouTube. In 1 minute, 300 hours of video are uploaded. So every minute of the day, 300 hours are uploaded for every minute. 4.95 billion videos will be watched today. It's absolutely extraordinary. Society has really grabbed the video, and I think it's because of the ubiquitous nature of the tools. It's the democratization of video, that you can now get it on your iPhone or your Android tablet or whatever it is. That we don't need to go to a theatre or to sit down in the living room and watch television. We can have video with us 24/7 now, and people enjoy video. And so I think, especially for the younger generation, all the data show that they're not reading hardly at all. They're not getting their information from even television broadcasts now. It's mainly downloadable material that you can get from the internet.
Lloyd, maybe a final question. When you speak to your students in New Zealand who are now enrolling to study science communication as a career choice, what would you tell them if they asked you, what is the biggest maybe challenge facing science communication at the moment, and maybe the biggest trend, in addition to what you've referred to now with the way the internet is changing things, but sort of just maybe your thoughts on challenges and trends in the field of science communication?
What are the challenges and trends in science communication? Well, I think the biggest challenge that we have is that it is extremely difficult, no matter how well motivated, no matter how good you are, to get your voice heard. we live in a world in which we are surrounded by just so much dross, so much information, and so the challenge is not just to produce something that will work, but to actually get it to the audience you want. And so I think that's a big part of science communication that we're not really even tackling particularly well at the moment. What do I see in terms of trends? I think one of the things about science communication is that it's a relatively young field, depending who you listen to, maybe 25, 30 years it's been around. And unlike other forms of, academic discipline, it doesn't really have a common theory, a common framework that holds it all together. And so what I see as a trend, and I see that happening now, is that people are working on, let's see if we can find much more of a common language. Because to me, my background as a scientist, I came to science communication as someone stepping out of science and more getting my feet wet in the area of science communication. And at first I was appalled. It was like, I came from an area where I could go and talk with a whole lot of colleagues, and we all had a groundwork, an understanding of what the basic principles were of that field, because we had a common theory. But in science communication, there was no such theory. And as a consequence, everyone was talking their different bit and language, and it was like honestly walking into, the United Nations and hearing 100 different languages being spoken. And I think for science communication to move forward, we've got to have a common language. And so I see that developing, and I'm enormously thrilled to be, riding on some of that. I think it's a great time to be a science communicator, because the world is really opening up. The world is our oyster. And the one thing is absolutely clear. We live in a world where there's heaps and heaps of problems. And at the heart of them all, both the cause of the problem, but also the solution to the problem, is science and technology. And we, the science communicators, we're the people that have the responsibility to take the science that's produced by the scientists and take it to the people. Because unless the general populace understands the science and technology that we engage with in all our lives, then we're not going to solve those problems, and we have to do it together.